The Roman Empire, a power built on debt. Rome didn't build its empire on courage alone. It built it on debt. We like to imagine the Roman legions as unstoppable warriors fueled by honor and discipline. But behind every polished helmet and sharpened gladius was a supply chain of staggering complexity and cost. Thousands of soldiers needed food, weapons, roads, and pay. Horses required feed. Siege engines needed timber and labor. And all of it required money, lots of it. The financial engine of conquest. So how did Rome finance centuries of conquest? And why does this still matter today? Because the deeper you look into Rome's war machine, the clearer the pattern becomes. War wasn't fought only on the battlefield. It was embedded in the financial system itself. And once that system was in motion, it couldn't stop. Expansion wasn't a choice, it was an economic necessity. Sound familiar? Let's take a step back. From citizen army to professional soldiers. In the early Republic, Rome's army was a citizen army. If you owned land, you could be drafted. Soldiers brought their own weapons and expected to return to their farms after the campaign. But as the Republic expanded, wars became longer and farther from home. The old model no longer worked. You couldn't just grab a spear and fight for a year. Professional soldiers were needed. It was then that Rome began to centralize military financing, paying state salaries to its troops. Not a lot, but enough to keep them loyal. Turning conquest into a revenue model. Then came the real transformation. Conquest became a revenue model. Each new province meant new taxes, new slaves, new gold mines, and new tribute. It was a self-reinforcing loop. War financed more war. And here's where it gets interesting and dangerous. Rome didn't just rely on taxes, it relied heavily on borrowing. During long and costly wars, such as the Punic Wars against Carthage, the Republic borrowed massive public loans from wealthy elites, especially the rising financial class, the equites. These weren't patriotic donations, they were investments. Investors expected returns in the form of interest payments, tax farming rights, and monopoly privileges in newly conquered territories. Thus, war became a business, and the more profitable it was, the more wars Rome waged. Sound familiar? The militarized economy and its costs. Over time, this militarized economy reshaped everything. Political power shifted to generals who could promise spoils. Senators became stakeholders in violence. Private contractors, known as publicani, managed everything from logistics to tax collection, skimming fortunes from the top. It was military-industrial capitalism dressed in a toga, and the costs piled up. To pay soldiers and creditors, the state constantly needed new revenue. When conquests slowed or uprisings drained the treasury, Rome resorted to the oldest trick in the book, debasing the currency. Under Emperor Nero, the silver content of the denarius was quietly reduced. Over the next 2 centuries, emperors continued this practice, turning what was once a reliable silver coin into a hollow promise. Inflation followed. Confidence eroded. By the 3rd century, Rome's monetary system was in free fall. Wealth disparity and monetary collapse. Meanwhile, the rich got richer. Senators and equites protected their wealth in land, slaves, and overseas accounts. The poor paid taxes and suffered under debased currency, while the elite benefited from insider deals and tax exemptions. Public services collapsed, corruption soared, and the burden of endless wars fell squarely on the lower classes through inflation, forced labor, and military conscription. This wasn't just a military collapse, it was a monetary one. Now pause and look around. Governments running massive budget deficits, wars financed through debt, central banks quietly debasing currency to cover the shortfall, a financial class enriched by defense contracts and crises, an economy where expansion, military, monetary, or market-based, is the only way to keep the system afloat. It's not a perfect parallel, but the DNA is disturbingly similar. the inevitable wall of expansion. What Rome teaches us is this: an economy built on expansion, especially violent expansion, eventually hits a wall. Lands to conquer run out, resources to extract dry up, enemies to fight disappear. When that happens, the system collapses inward. Debt remains, expectations remain, revenue dries up. That's when the state starts squeezing its own people. Rome turned to heavier taxes, further currency debasement, and tighter control. Bread and circuses were offered to keep the masses quiet, while the elite fortified their villas. Sound familiar? Today's mechanics, eerily similar. Today we don't call it tribute, we call it taxes, quantitative easing, or monetary policy. But the mechanics are eerily similar. Central banks print money, governments spend more than they earn, the rich buy assets, the poor buy groceries with shrinking paychecks. Wars are still financed through debt. The U.S. spent over $2 trillion on the war in Afghanistan, mostly funded by debt. Who got the contracts? Who earned the interest? Who paid the bill through inflation, service cuts, and unstable currencies? You already know the answer. And like in Rome, the system feeds itself. Once debt becomes the default, you don't need an emergency to print money, you just need to avoid collapse. The exceptional becomes normalized. The longer it continues, the more everyone must pretend everything is fine. Until it isn't. That's why history matters. These aren't just dusty stories, they're warning signs. Lessons from Rome. A warning. Rome shows us a state that outsourced too much power to private finance, became addicted to expansion, hollowed out its currency, and crushed its citizens under unsustainable obligations. Not because they were evil, but because the system had no off switch. Today, we live in a different empire. Digital, global, and powered by capital flows instead of legions. But the game is still the same. Money and power move together. War is still profitable. Inflation still punishes the weak. Financial illusions work until they don't. So what can you do? Start by seeing the pattern. Most people don't. Most people think inflation is random, taxes are necessary, debt is freedom, and growth can continue forever. The Stoics had a word for that: delusion. You can't completely opt out of the system, but you can understand it. You can stop playing blindly. You can build resilience, not just with money, but with mindset. That means studying financial history, not just personal finance. That means watching for systemic stress, not just market hype. That means asking, who profits when I remain confused? Because you weren't supposed to know this. You weren't supposed to ask how Rome financed its wars or how the modern state does it now. You were supposed to focus on headlines, theater, GDP, not mechanisms or incentives. But now you know. And once you know, there's no unseeing it. Financial education isn't just about budgeting and investing, it's about understanding power, systems, and seeing through the illusion of stability. Conclusion. Empires fall when the math stops working, and no one dares to fix it. So next time you hear about a new conflict, a stimulus package, or a crisis, don't just watch. Follow the money. Who lends, who earns, and who ultimately pays. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that empires don't fall when the enemy breaks the gate. They fall when the math stops working and no one dares to fix it. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.